Well, the reign of Peter the Great from 1689 until his death in 1725 was a period of fundamental transformation in Russian culture and the Russian state. Um, Probably the greatest transformation of this type before the 20th century. The best way to figure out how these changes took place and what did they really mean, which is, of course, a complicated issue, is, I think, to start by looking at the way the Tsar and his wife were portrayed at the time. The first picture that we have here is a picture of Peter the Great's father, Tsar Alexei, in formal ceremonial dress. It has the long robe, the traditional crown, all highly decorated, and the Tsar, of course, himself with a beard. That's the father. Now here we have the son. This is Peter, probably around 1710 or 1715. As you can see, he's not wearing a hat. He has shaved his beard, kept the mustache, and his dress is completely different. This is West European kind of dress that a monarch would normally be portrayed in. It's probably a breastplate, a bit of armor, which was, of course, at this point largely ceremonial, but still part of the appearance of any great nobleman or certainly any great monarch. Now let's look at Peter's first wife. This is Yevdokia. It's not the most beautiful portrait artistically, but it does give you a sense of what she looked like. You see, of course, her hair is covered. It's so dark you can't see it. The robe covers everything. This is the traditional dress of the upper class Russian woman of the 17th century. And now we have Peter's wife number 2. This is a different world, I think you will see. Not only, first of all, we can see what her hair do. We can see her hair. Her shoulders and part of her bosom are revealed by the dress, which is the typical dress of an early 18th century upper class European woman. And of course, the wives of the Western Europeans, kings, dressed this way. Of course, this Peter's second wife, Catherine, actually wasn't from the upper classes. She was the daughter of a Latvian servant girl who had been captured in the war with Sweden and eventually married Peter. But she was his wife and his tsaritsa and his successor. And then she presented herself in public, of course, the way any other European monarch would. Now, in order to understand the depth of transformation that took place in these 36 years of Peter's reign, we need to briefly look at Russia, what it was like in 1689, at the moment when which Peter became the Tsar, in fact, not just in name. The center of Russia, and of course the Russian state, was Moscow. Everyone knows this picture. This is what we know what it looks like. This is the not only just the main fortress in the center of town, but it is, of course, the quintessentially Russian place with the walls and the towers with the high pointed roofs on them, and inside the Tsar's palace. Of course, the palace you see in this picture was built in the 19th century, but the churches are, of course, from the 15th through the 16th century. This is, of course, what makes it so particularly Russian. The Tsar's original palace from the time of Peter's youth is, of course, gone, but some parts of it are still here. Again, this is a classic tourist photo. The room on the right is what's called the Hall of Facets, which was built in the 1490s and is the principal remaining part of the 15th through 17th century Russian palace. And the church on the left, the Church of the Annunciation, is, of course, was part of the complex of the palace as well. This was one of the Kremlin churches. Now, if you look through the rest of the Kremlin, of course, you see all the other sacred places of the Russia before Peter the Great, the Dormition Cathedral. This is this church of in which the serving priest, so to speak, was in fact the patriarch of the Russian state. This is the core of the Russian Orthodox Church, is right here, and it's essentially a 10-minute walk from the palace. I mean, a slow walk. It's right next to it. All of this is concentrated in essentially one place. Now, in the course of the late 17th century, things are beginning to change. The problem with the Russians is that if we could go back for a minute to the Dormition Cathedral, for the Russians, of course, the culture that they had gotten had come from the Byzantine Empire. But that meant that what the Russians got was not the whole of Byzantine culture. Byzantine culture was a very complicated phenomenon. It involved almost the whole of the heritage of classical antiquity. The Greek side of it is, they are the ones, after all, the Byzantines, who had the manuscripts of Plato and Aristotle and Euripides and everything else. That's why we know they existed, because the Byzantines kept them. But when the Russians got Byzantine culture from the Greeks in the 9th century, they didn't get the secular culture. What they got was the religious culture. They got the religion. This is, of course, why we have the churches that we see. The result of this is that up until the 17th century, Russia has what is essentially a religious culture with almost nothing in any way of any sort of secular culture. There is no medieval Russian science. I mean, there is a medieval West European science that was cultivated by the scholastics in the universities. It's not very impressive by modern terms, but it is some kind of science. And the Byzantines had the same. The Russians were not interested in it. They had virtually nothing in the way of natural sciences. They did not translate any of the works of the classical antiquity into Slavic, and so that what they had was an exclusively religious culture. In the time of Peter's father, Tsar Alexei, things began to change. And what began to change was that the Russians began to get a kind of hybrid culture from Kiev, from the Ukrainians. And what I mean by hybrid culture is, I think, very well illustrated by this picture. This is the Kievan Church of St. Sophia, the principal church of the city of Kiev, and the one founded in the earliest Middle Ages by the Kiev princes, Vladimir and his successors. What you see in this, what I mean by hybrid, is that what you see is two levels. The lower level of the church, with the part that's been left uncovered, the brick by the restorers, is the medieval part. That comes from the 11th century. The top, with a particular type of domes, which you note are different from the ones in Moscow, this is 17th century Polish Baroque, Ukrainianized, or made into for the Orthodox purposes of Orthodox church architecture in Kiev. And that's the kind of thing that the Russians are getting in the 17th century in Peter's father, the time of Peter's father. They're getting a church that's getting a religious culture which is Orthodox in its belief system, but is in fact very heavily influenced by Western European Baroque culture, primarily through the Ukrainians. It produces a kind of a hybrid. And that begins to come to Moscow with various teachers and people preaching at the Moscow court in the 1670s and 80s. So that's already there when Peter is a young man, but it's very restricted in scope. And it's also very much a variant of the traditional Orthodox culture. Peter came to power with real power at the age of 17 in 1689, when he overthrew the regency of his half-sister Sophia. He was 17 years old, and he came to power as the result of the intrigues among the boyars who were discontented with Sophia and decided that they had better go with the real Tsar, Peter. Peter was now an adult, and it was time for him to do what he wanted to do. Well, what did he want to do? Peter did not have a coherent plan. I mean, we should not assume that he comes to the throne with a great plan of how to reorganize Russian society and Russian culture. He also certainly had not only not a plan, nothing like what you might call an ideology. He had a number of very specific goals. And it is out of those goals, those specific goals, and eventually out of his gradually involving military needs, that he begins to change things. When he came to power in 1689, he was, for the first few years, largely under the influence of his mother, but he already had some ideas of his own. One of his principal personal tastes, which is dominant throughout his whole life, is that he was fascinated with boats and sailing. The first thing that he did in 1693, when he was old enough and he was already married, he had a child, but his mother was still alive, and he was not really entirely in charge, was to go up north to Archangel. He wanted to go up north to see the Dutch and English ships come in for their annual voyage from Western Europe to Russia, where they were the principal trading partners of the Russian state. When he was going up there, his mother sent him a note after he left, telling him that he was under no circumstances was he to go out on any of the boats. It was, in her view, far too dangerous. So he obeyed. But he saw the ships, came back to Moscow, and then later that winter, his mother died. Within a few weeks of his mother's death, Peter went back up north, and this time he went out for several weeks on board the Dutch ships to see what it was like, what sailing was really about, and how did they do it. And when he came back, he also decided that it was time for him to get Russia into the war that they were supposed to be involved in with the Turks. Peter's half-sister had made an alliance with the Austrians, the Habsburgs, the papacy, and Venice in 1686 to fight the Ottoman Empire. But as a matter of fact, Russia had done very little about this in these ensuing years. And in 1694, Peter decided it was time to get involved in this and to capture the Turkish fort that stood at the mouth of the Don River on the Sea of Azov. And in the next 2 years, he sent an expedition, a military expedition down there, which involved, among other things, building a navy. Russia had no navy, and he realized he couldn't capture the fort unless he could cut the Turks off from the sea. So he built a navy from nothing and sailed it down the river, cut off the Turks from the fort. The fort fell to the Russian navy, and Peter now had his first victory. Peter then decided that it was time to go to the West. He wanted to see, I think we will wait on this for a while. He wanted to go to the West, and he wanted to see what was going to be what Western society had to offer. What he was particularly interested in, of course, was shipbuilding. So his main place that he went to that he headed for was the Netherlands, and which was the Dutch were, of course, the main trading partners of the Russians. The English were just coming on, and he got to the Netherlands, and he not only did the shipbuilding, he also met the head of the Netherlands Republic, who was also King William III of England, had long discussions with King William, and from all of these people learned that he should also go to England. He went to England, and there he spent time not only at shipbuilding, he also did other things, talked with the Anglican clergy, went to a Quaker meeting of all things in London, and then went back to the Netherlands, where he spent a great deal of time not only on shipbuilding, but on all sorts of collections of natural curiosities. This was a very big part of European science in the 1690s, the collection of exotic, all sorts of things, exotic seashells, mammoth bones. They already found some strange animals that they had encountered in the East and West Indies and so on. And he decided that it was necessary, that he should see all of this stuff before he went back to Russia. On the way back to Russia, as he returned, of course, the war was coming to an end. The Austrians were tired; they pulled out of the war, and Peter eventually had to compromise with the Turks, keeping Azov but getting out of the war. On the way back, he met the King of Poland. The King of Poland, who was also the Elector of Saxony, had all sorts of plans about how Poland should become a more important country, and particularly how the king should become more important. And so with this, I'm going to do a little bit of, yes, we will do a little bit of return back to Moscow and see what we're going to get. Peter came back, of course, to the traditional Moscow. Things had not changed very much. You can see this is a sort of medieval city. It's got this Kremlin in the center. There's nothing much that's distinctive about it, or it's surrounded by the houses of artisans, merchants, great noblemen. And of course, this is how it looked with the old palaces from the river. So what Peter comes back to is very much the traditional Moscow, the traditional Moscow and the traditional city. Nevertheless, in order to fight this war, he's got to reorganize the army. He's already been doing this. And so when he comes back, there are a whole series of very quick changes. One of them is when he comes back is when he starts telling the boyars that they have to shave their beards. And he orders that the soldiers and the army would wear what he called Hungarian dress. In other words, no more of the long coat and the long robes and so on of the traditional Russian upper class and even middle class dress. Now you're going to dress more or less like West Europeans, with a short coat and tight pants. And the women will wear the equivalent of the female dress. This doesn't seem very important, but of course what it does is it creates a different atmosphere, because what Peter wants to do also is to bring a great many people into Russia to supply his army with skilled soldiers and officers, and also to do other things which will gradually become necessary as the war unfolds. So why is he going to have a war with Sweden? Sweden, of course, doesn't seem a very major country to modern people, but you should realize that in 1700, Sweden was the dominant military and political power of the north of Europe. This had been relatively recent. Sweden became an important military power only in the course of the 17th century, starting really in the 30 Years' War. But in the course of becoming an important power, Sweden had acquired a number of territories, as you can see in this map, which were quite considerable. Medieval Sweden before 1700 included, of course, what we think of today as Sweden. It also included Finland. Finland was part of Sweden from the 13th century until 1809. But the Swedes had also captured what is today Estonia and northern Latvia, and the territory on which St. Petersburg sits, which was called Ingria, was captured by the Swedes in 1618. It had been part of Russia from 800 AD until 1618, but in the wake of the time of troubles, the Swedes had captured that. Furthermore, the Swedes, we are sort of used to thinking of these boundaries as being permanent, but the southern part of Sweden, which was, of course, also the most productive and richest part of Sweden, had been part of Denmark until the 1650s. So what that meant was that the Swedes had a whole series of potential enemies: the Danes, the Poles, the Russians, and many of the North German territories. So therefore, when the King of Poland proposed to Peter, why don't we do this? That was not complicated to get him to do it. And in 1700, Peter and an army marched into this area here, which is today on the Estonian-Russian border, and laid siege to the city of Narva. At that point, we have a new phenomenon appears, and this is Charles XII, the King of Sweden. One of the reasons why the King of Poland and the other European monarchs in the north thought it would be worth trying to challenge the Swedes was because Charles XII was actually very young. He was only about 20 years old, and nobody knew anything about him. Whether he would be any good as a commander, as a political leader, he just wasn't part of their experience. So the result was that all three, Russia, Poland, and Denmark, declared war on Sweden, and Charles outsmarted them. He moved his army into Denmark, knocked the Danes out of the war in a few weeks, and then moved his army east to relieve the siege of Narva and to fight with Peter's army, in which he was quite successful. Peter's army was badly defeated and had to withdraw. At that point, Charles made a very big mistake. Rather than try to pursue the Russian army, he thought that apparently that they weren't important enough to worry about, that he decided that his principal opponent was going to be the Poles. So he spent the next 6 years chasing the King of Poland around, and eventually in 1706 managed to unseat Augustus, the King of Poland, and establish in his place a Swedish puppet. This meant, and by 1706, that Russia was now alone, the only one fighting Sweden. And the victorious Charles thought that now was the time to go east and deal with Peter the Great. Well, what had Peter been doing all of these years? And that is part of that's our story. What Peter had been doing in those years, while Charles was chasing Augustus and the Poles around and trying to get control of that territory, Peter abandoned trying to capture Narva and concentrated on Ingria, on the territory, the river, Neva River, that runs from Lake Ladoga into the Gulf of Finland. All that was there when the Russians got into the war were a few small Swedish settlements, a very small local population, and one or two, literally, it was a couple of batteries of Swedish guns. So Peter went into the area, captured it, and immediately, already in 1703, when the war is still raging and there is no peace in sight, decides to build a fort at the mouth of the Neva River. And this is, of course, the fortress of St. Peter and Paul, which is still there in the center of Petersburg. You have to imagine that around this is nothing but marshes. All there is the fortress. The walls are the ones that Peter built. And of course, he also built in the center of it the Church of St. Peter and Paul. Those are his patron saints, with St. Peter, of course. And this is going to be the new city. It's not necessarily, at the first, was not going to be a capital. That came later, but it was certainly going to be a Russian port on the Baltic Sea, the first one. Now, while he is doing this, the while he's building the city of St. Petersburg and first starting it, then there are a whole series of other things that are going on. All of them are the results of the fact that the Russians need to have a more modern military, but that means they have to have a more modern state, and they have to have a more modern education system. Particularly, they've got to have a lot more in the way of mathematics. One of the first secular books that's printed in Russian in Russia in Peter's time is in fact Leonid Magnitsky's Arithmetica, as it's called. It's not just arithmetic. It's in fact goes well into considerable amount of mathematics, because of course you have to have at least geometry, trigonometry, and various other things if you're going to have navigation, ballistics, fortification, hydraulics, and all sorts of other things that are necessary if you're going to have not only a modern army, but also you're going to have more modern cities. You're going to have a city, going to have to build a city in St. Petersburg on a river delta, which means you're going to have canals. And all of this requires, you don't just dig a ditch, you have to have a certain amount of, you have to plan it out, and there has to be a certain amount of planning, and very careful planning. Those are the canals that Petersburg run through Petersburg now, are the ones that were laid down mostly in Peter's time. So that is the side of it. In order to do that, Peter, of course, therefore has to rebuild a new kind of state, and that he is going to have to expand things. He's going to have to make a government that is more efficient, more organized, and that will come in the course of time as he is dealing with Charles XII and the Swedes. With Charles XII, of course, the problem is that Charles has defeated all of his enemies except Peter, and so what he does is turn to the east and marches through northern Poland and pretty well through what is today northern Belarusia, aiming for Moscow. Charles was convinced that on the way that he would get there, that there was a great deal of discontent with Peter's reforms, and that therefore that when he got to the border, maybe the boyars would overthrow Peter. And in any case, he was convinced that the army would not be able to stand up to him. He was, after all, one of the great commanders and had had victory after victory for the previous 6 years, with great commanders of the time equal to William III and the rest of them from that period, Marlborough. So he gets to the border, and in fact, nothing happens. Not only that, the Swedish mercenary officers, one of them wrote back to one of the English officers serving as a mercenary with the Swedes, wrote back that as the Swedish army approached the Russian border, the Englishman thought that the Swedes were going to have more and more difficulty because the Russian junior officers had finally learned their trade. In other words, in all these years of fighting, that finally the Russian army had acquired the experience to be able to deal with the Swedes and more or less one-on-one in the battlefield. And when he got to the border, Charles was the end of the summer. What was he going to do? The answer was to go south. Since there was no revolt happening in Moscow, the situation seemed to be fairly stable. The one ally that he had was the head of the Ukrainian Cossacks. The head of the Ukrainian Cossacks, Ivan Mazepa, well, this was a particular story. The Ukrainian Cossack hetmanate had become part of the Russian state in 1653 as a result of the great Ukrainian revolt against Poland in those years. When the Ukrainian Cossacks revolted against the Poles, they realized Poland was, of course, in the 17th century, a major military power. And the Ukrainians realized that they couldn't really do this on their own. So they sent messages to Khmelnytsky, the head of the Ukrainian Cossacks, sent messages to Tsar Alexei, Peter's father, telling him and asking the Tsar to take, and the phrase he used, to take us under your high hand. And the result was that the Ukrainian Cossack state was then incorporated into the Russian monarchy in 1654 on the Pereyaslav Treaty, and that autonomous structure remained until 1708. For various reasons, Mazeppa was not very happy about this. He was becoming more and more important. So was Peter. There was a sort of inevitable conflict there. And so Hetman Mazeppa went over to the Swedes. The problem with that was for Mazeppa and for Charles was that most of the Ukrainian Cossacks didn't follow him. For most of the Ukrainian Cossack rank and file, Mazeppa was another upper class oligarch that they weren't interested in, and that they were, like most peasants of the time, convinced that you were better off to have a powerful ruler rather than an aristocratic oligarchy. So they wanted to stay with the Tsar. And that, of course, meant that Charles was now stuck way far, hundreds and hundreds of miles away from Sweden, in the northeastern part of what's today the Ukraine. And in the summer of 1709, he decided to move north toward Moscow, assuming that he would be able to meet and defeat Peter's army. And on the course of doing that, the Swedes laid siege to the city of Poltava. This siege lasted for several weeks, and Peter decided that this was the place that he wanted to meet the Swedes. So what he did was to come down, bring the Russian army down toward Poltava, cross the river 10 or 15 miles north of Poltava, and then stop, make an armed camp. In other words, he was forcing the Swedes to attack him. Why do you want to do that? Because, of course, that Peter knew that his army was, a lot of it was new. Many of these men were not very well trained. They had only been never been under fire, or only in minor engagements. Whereas he was fighting against, with the Swedish army, this was a regular army that had been fighting victoriously for 6 years. You don't want to try in that sort of situation to make an offensive battle. You want the experienced army to attack you. Therefore, and your less experienced army can survive the attack. That's, of course, that's standard military strategy. There's nothing unique to Peter's military genius here. Everyone knew this. So he waited, and Charles had no choice because he was running out of supplies. He knew he had to attack the Russians, and so eventually he did. Peter had surrounded the whole area with masses of Russian, Ukrainian, Cossacks, Kalmyks, Bashkirs. It was extremely difficult for the Swedes to live off the land and get food for the army. So Charles had to attack. So he did. So what he did is in the early morning in late June, he moved north out of his own camp toward Peter's army, toward Peter's camp, got up there where it was, and then turned right and moved toward the Russian entrenchments. And it happened more or less as Peter had hoped for. That is to say, the Swedish army got up to the front. They made essentially, after a small amount of exchange of musket fire, attacked with bayonets into the Russian army. They managed to knock out the first line of Russian defense on the right, but there were two more Russian lines behind that. They couldn't move any farther. Peter realized that the Swedes were stuck. He looked at the Swedish line, saw that there were gaps forming, ordered his men forward, and the Swedish attack collapsed. And by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Sweden ceased to be a great power. So Peter was now in a very different situation. He was now the victorious commander of the Russian army. Charles had to take refuge in the Ottoman Empire. The Swedish state and army managed to try to hold on to its territories in Northern Europe over the next few years. But Peter now had to decide what he was going to do with the state, and he had realized that he had to do things more than just fight the army, fight the war and improve the army, that you had to have a state that would back up this new military unit. This meant you had to have a new state. And where do you get your idea? Where are you going to learn how to make a new organized, coherent state instead of the massively complicated, ramshackle collection of old Russian offices? Answer: you learn from your enemy. You get it from the Swedes. So Peter sent to Sweden a German official and jurist to collect information on the administrative structure of the Swedish state, which he did very simply. He just went to bookstores and bought the published table of organization, which the Swedes had, of course, published as part of their laws. And he just brought that stuff back to Petersburg. It was translated into Russian, and it produced the new structure of the Russian state, which you see here in this picture. This is actually better known to tourists and to people in Petersburg as the 19th century building of the University of St. Petersburg, which it was in the 19th century. But these buildings were actually built in about 1720 for Peter's new government. These were the 12 colleges, because the latest administrative fashion in Europe at that time was not to have a single person to be, say, Minister of Finance. You wanted a committee, and you called it a college. So that was what Peter was going to do, was to build a new government. But of course, that involved building a new city. Now, one of the things about the city in Peter's time that is important to realize to understand how Peter worked is that the city that you're looking at when you go to there now is not entirely or exactly what he built. It's much more magnificent and much greater than what Peter had in mind. This is a very interesting picture, which only surfaced about 20 or 30 years ago and is not very well known. But it was discovered by one of my Swedish colleagues, historians of Russia, Swedish archives. And what it is a drawing made from memory by one of the Swedish officers who was captured at Poltava, spent 10 years or so in Russia, and was eventually got himself a job working on the building of St. Petersburg. And when he returned to Stockholm, he drew from memory a bird's eye view of what Petersburg looked like when he left in 1720. So what you can see there is the middle of the river, of course, is the fortress with the tall tower, with the tall spire on the church. You can see there's this little bit of a space there in the center on the south side of the river, which is where the Admiralty is now. But basically, this is a city of 2 to 3 story buildings with red tile roofs. It's not any kind of great grand palace. The biggest building that's there is out on the island, and that's actually Menshikoff's palace. Menshikov was Peter's favorite, and also was the governor of St. Petersburg, the person in charge on the spot of building the city. What Peter actually built, his idea of what the houses actually that he wanted to live in his time was also fairly modern. What you're looking at in this picture is actually the first building of the Winter Palace, which, as you see, is a 2.5 story or 3 story European house, more or less in Dutch style. The staircase in the front is very characteristic of the upper class Netherlands houses of 1710, 1720. This is what he wanted to live in. He wasn't trying to build enormous palaces as he started to build the city. You can see that some of the planning is already there with the city. If you look at it very carefully and you know the city, you realize that there in the middle of it is the Admiralty, and that this is actually Nevsky Prospect, which you see is just a sort of a track with partly through some of the swampy areas. This is, I think, Voznesensky Prospect, which was already more of a city, and that most of the actual dwelling places are on the St. Petersburg Island on the north. Peter's little version of the Winter Palace was here. St. Isaac's was a very small church of no importance. Peter generally went to church in a small church of the Trinity that was on the north side of the river. In other words, in order to go to church, he had to go in a boat, which for him was, of course, a normal part of life. And many of the great aristocrats lived along this area on St. Petersburg Island. Later on, that all changed, and most of the aristocratic houses ended up south of the river. But in Peter's time, this is the way the city looked. And this rather modest scale is also true of the suburban palaces. I mean, I'm not going to go through all of them, but the one thing that is, I think, noticeable is this is actually the first Peterhof, if you look at it. And if you look at the modern version, you realize that it's only that central part. You see there are sort of three parts there, if you look back. That is the old Peterhof. And of course, the fountains are still there. But all that stuff on the side and the back comes later. That was not part of the palace that Peter built. And the one place that really remains from Peter's time is what's called the Summer Palace, which is the Letny Dvorets, which is, I mean, it's only by courtesy we call it a palace. Look, this is a 6-room house. And the only part of it that's really, I don't know, elegant or remarkable is really in the Letny Sad, the summer garden around it, with its big collection of early 18th century Italian sculpture. So this is the way things work. Much of the way Petersburg was built was the work of, in fact, Alexander Menshikov. This is Menshikov, who was Peter's principal favorite. Menshikov was an extremely competent administrator, and he was also extremely crooked. The first big crisis of Peter's reign is in 1714, when he realized, he figured out that Menshikov had been stealing money that was supposed to be used to build the city of St. Petersburg. And of course, Menshikov was smart. He did build the city, but he also massively overcharged the treasury and kept the difference. Peter also had to decide what he was going to do with other things when he built the new city. Like, what are we going to do with the church? Moscow, of course, you realize, had in the Kremlin, there were 2 monasteries in the Kremlin. There were half a dozen in and around the city. The city was surrounded by 4 or 5 major monasteries. And then, of course, there was the Trinity Monastery about a day and a half away. Moscow was saturated with churches. When Peter built the St. Petersburg, there is only one, and there is to this day only one monastery in St. Petersburg, the monastery of Alexander Nevsky. And of course, it's named for a person who is not known for monastic spirituality, but for his military successes, Alexander Nevsky. At the same time, of course, Peter was clearly not only not an atheist, Peter was in his way quite pious. I mean, he went to during Holy Week, he usually went to confession, took communion 2 or 3 times. And he was very fond of all the sermons. But his conception of how the church ought to operate was rather different from the traditional Russian church. For one thing, he decided that it was not a good idea to have a patriarch. He first put in charge of the church one of the Ukrainian clerics, Stefan Yavorsky, but only made him a kind of placeholder, not the patriarch, and then eventually abolished the whole structure and established a committee of bishops, which was called the Holy Synod, that would rule the church. So that there was, in other words, that you keep the belief system, you keep the clergy, you keep the bishops, but you don't have any longer a single person who incarnates the whole church in the mind of the population and of the church. Now, of course, the great crisis of political internal crisis of Peter's reign was the story of his son Alexei, whom you see here, Alexei Petrovich, the son of Peter and his first wife. This crisis came in 1716. Peter's relations with his son had been deteriorating for several years. That he had, of course, put away, had essentially divorced his first wife, married a second wife, Catherine, whom we saw earlier on in this talk, and was beginning to produce children with the second wife. In 1715, simultaneously, Tsar Alexei, so Peter himself produced another son, and Tsarevich Alexei, who had been married to a German princess, produced an heir too. So there were now 3 possible heirs to the throne. And this led to a radical deterioration in relations with Peter and his son. The result was that the son in the summer of 1716 essentially disappeared. He simply left St. Petersburg without telling anybody where he was going. And then he in fact, ended up in Vienna, where the Emperor Charles the Sixth, we'll get that right. The Emperor Charles VI was actually his brother-in-law. He and the emperor were married to sisters. And he told the emperor that he wanted to take refuge there, that there were all sorts of people among the aristocracy that supported him, and that he wanted support from the emperor against his father. This, by the way, story was largely falsified in the 19th century, which is why it's not really part of much of Russian historiography until recently. But that was what it was about. As a matter of fact, the Tsarevich Alexei was probably exaggerating the degree of support that he had from the Russian elite, and that eventually Peter managed to, through his agents, to convince him to come back to Russia. And in 1718, this led to a sort of major political crisis. Alexei essentially admitted that he had been trying to do things against his father, and Peter removed him from succession to the throne. And then he very soon after that died of natural causes, as far as we know. He had never been very healthy. So that, by 1718, produced a kind of closure. I mean, in other words, that it was quite obvious that nobody was going to be able to do anything against any of Peter's ideas or any of his plans. The war with Sweden was effectively the Russians had won, and Charles simply wouldn't give up until finally he was, well, anyway, Charles II was killed while he was watching the battle against the Danes in Norway, and eventually Sweden had to surrender, which meant that Russia then got the territory, which was what's now northern Latvia, Estonia, Ingria with St. Petersburg, and the southeastern corner of Finland. and Russia became now an important European power. This meant, of course, that Peter had the time to finish up all of the various cultural changes that he had been doing over the years from time to time. One of the things that happens is that Peter actually decided finally to build a more impressive looking winter palace. This is also not the one you see there. That was the result of the 1740s. But in the last few years of his reign, he finally built on the site of what is now the Winter Palace, one that was at least a little bit more like a European aristocratic palace. But in addition to that, there are also a whole series of more fundamental changes. The School of Navigation was not the only place that was producing modern education. There were a number of other small schools, none of them very large, but also a great many of the nobility realized that it was time for them to find tutors to give their children a more European education. And something that was quite important was that Peter decided to reorganize the printing of books. I mean, it's difficult to underestimate how important this is. Russia, of course, had been printing books since the 1560s, all of them, virtually 99% of them, not only religious, but effectively liturgical. For everything else, it was still a manuscript culture. Peter decided in 1708 that they would not only start printing books, but that they would also reorganize the typeface so that they would be easier to read. The traditional typeface, of which this is an example, this is the Magnitsky's arithmetic, which was one of the first printed books that was not religious and was still done in the old typeface. The typeface was really taken from the type of handwriting used for manuscripts, and it was somewhat complicated to read and somewhat decorative. So Peter decided we want a simpler typeface. And that's pretty well what the Russian typeface is now, is a variant of the one that Peter developed in 1708. And this, coincidentally, is one of the geometry textbooks that he came up with. And this is, of course, the other side of the cultural changes. Besides that, was that Peter himself took a certain amount of interest in what sort of books were going to be printed. He wanted, for example, of course, the various scientific and mathematically in particular, and scientific books. A lot of them that were printed in Peter's time, I think, are best described as textbooks. I mean, there was no point for the Russians to try and print great thoughts of the great minds of Western Europe if people didn't know the basic vocabulary to discuss them. So what we have is, for example, the German, now largely forgotten, political writer and historian Samuel Pufendorf, a big bestseller in the 1690s, who produced a kind of summary of everyone then's political thinking in Western Europe called The Duties of Right and on the duty of man and the citizen. So that Peter orders this specifically to be translated into Russian and was published there in Russia. Pufendorf also produced a history of Europe. You realize that sounds very normal to us. In 1695, a history of Europe was something new. It was a political history of all the major European states, including a chapter on Russia, which was not very complimentary. And the publishers actually asked Peter, should we print this? And he said, yes, print it. Of course you print it. After all, everyone this is what many people believe. You ought to know this. And by the way, that was Pufendorf's History of Europe was an absolutely international bestseller. There were 2 copies of it in the first Yale library in Old Saybrook in 1704. And it's very commonly found. The English translation is very commonly found in in used bookstores in England and America. In any case, the final thing that Peter did that was probably in many ways the most important was, of course, the Academy of Sciences. And that's why we have this picture. Of course, this is the famous bronze horseman put up by Catherine the Great in the late 18th century. But across the river in the background to the left of the statue is the Kunstkammer. The Kunstkammer was Peter's cabinet of curiosities. This was one of the cultural fashions of 17th and 18th century Europe. And he had filled it with all sorts of collections of those exotic type that he had seen in Amsterdam so early in his reign in 1697 and 98. And that was given to the Academy of Sciences, and it was its first building. So that when Peter died, he actually didn't live to see it established, but all the legislation was ready so that when Peter died, his widow, Catherine I, signed the decree, and the Russian Academy of Sciences came into being in 1725. So this is basically the story. The thing that is important to realize is that Peter did all these things which were quite fundamental. I mean, the bringing of science into the center of Russian culture, along with religion, history, and everything else, meant that in 36 years, Peter essentially did the work of the European Renaissance and Baroque eras. In other words, he did in 36 years what took Europe 250 years or 300 years to do. The other thing is that he didn't do this because he came up with some sort of plan. I guess, if you want to say he had a bit of genius, the genius was not to come up with a great idea just by sitting there and thinking. It was to come up with the idea that as you rebuilt your army and built your city and had to build fortresses and know about statistics and navigation, meant that you realized that you had to know mathematics. And you couldn't know mathematics if you didn't know languages. You had to learn Latin. Remember, the language of science in Europe in 1700 was still Latin. Newton wrote his Principia Mathematica not in English. He wrote it in Latin. If you wanted an audience, you had to write it in an international language, and it wasn't French yet. That was Latin. It was still Latin. You also needed modern languages, so that the Russian elite started learning French and German. The new state was going to be built on a conception that was essentially juridical. It was about state sovereignty, not about whether or not the ruler was a good Orthodox monarch. That's what his father and his grandfather had thought. The important thing was whether or not the ruler was a good Orthodox monarch. No, the point here now was that the state should have a legal foundation, and it should be based on the sovereignty of the state as conceived in West European political thought, the work of Hugo Grotius and various other people. This was, of course, absolutely crucial for the survival of the Russian society and state. I mean, we may find the old churches, I mean, I spend my life teaching people about them. We may find the old churches and the icons and the liturgy beautiful and so on. But if you wanted to survive in the world of 1700, it wasn't enough. You had to have the science. You had to have the administration. You had to have the modern structure of the state. The societies in the 18th century, as time went on, that didn't adopt West European science, culture, and society were crushed. Remember that India was not conquered by the British state. It was conquered by a private company. Um, if you had the ability to send ships out, if you could make Western artillery, if you could train Western soldiers, if you could do all the navigation and the science, and you could construct more, sophisticated administrative structures, then you could either you could take over the world effectively. If you didn't do that, they were going to take over you. And that is, of course, what happened to India and to China and in the Ottoman Empire. The Russians were not taken over. They adopted the European culture. And of course, that from that moment on, Russian culture is essentially part of the West.
Thank you everyone for amazing questions. One of the most common questions I receive is about Peter the Great and modern Russia and so-called myth of Peter the Great. So how is Peter regarded in modern day Russia, and is it somehow different from the Soviet Union times?
Um, well, okay. First of all, I think you have to realize that if we go back to the pre-revolutionary era, there are, of course, I mean, the view of Peter was largely divided. I mean, there are the Slavophiles, of course, were basically thought he was bad. I mean, that all of this had been bad for Russia and that the traditional Russian culture was far superior. Most of the liberal intelligentsia, of course, was generally favorable to the results, but they were very divided on whether or not they thought it was, whether or not he did it. In other words, they thought that he was maybe too hard on people in carrying it out. I think that's a lot of that's a little bit I mean, I think it's a little bit unrealistic looking at the world of 1700. But of course, you wouldn't want to do that in 1900. No, I mean, in that sense, of course, that's why people were worried about it. As far as the Soviets, of course, up until the 1930s were sharply negative about Peter as they were about everything in the Tsarist regime. All of them were bad. Then they suddenly decide in the middle of the 1930s that uh, to change the direction and that Peter becomes some extent a good guy. I mean, not entirely, but to some extent a good guy. Um, and I hate to use this kind of rather vulgar terminology like a good guy, but frankly, a lot of it's about on that level. Um, it's not very sophisticated. Of course, what that meant was that meant that people who were serious historians like Bogoslovsky and others in the 1930s suddenly could get their book published, which was not a possibility in the 1920s. I mean, we have this idea that the 20s was some sort of age of relative freedom, whereas the 30s was not. Well, I'm not sure that's very accurate. For many people, it simply meant that you had a different group of people after you. Um, the the Soviets sort of basically from the Soviets tried to uh, make a kind of compromise between Marxism and the desire to have, folk heroes. I mean, this is the basic problem of Soviet historical ideology. There is Marxism, which pushes you in some directions and then in other ways, but you want to have always good guys and bad guys at the same time. There's nothing in Marxism which says that you should see that, for instance, the Tsars of the 18th or 19th century as any worse than anybody else, but nevertheless, that in the Soviet ideology, you could not present any of the Tsars as positive. I mean, a good example of this is Catherine the Great. I mean, you simply couldn't say anything positive about her easily. Um, The exception to that, to some extent, was Peter. There was actually a book, Peter was the only Tsar on whom there was actually a serious scholarly biography um, published between 1917 and 1981 by a guy named Lenko in around 1980. I mean, it's not perfect, but it's amazing that it was actually published. So what is the Soviet ideology about Peter is to a large extent not the writings of Soviet era historians about Peter. It's what was the material, the guidelines of the apparatus of the Central Committee of the party, I think is what you're really talking about. Of course, this is much more complicated nowadays. And by and large, I think it's noticeable that the only one of the Russian Tsars that is presented moderately favorably in official ideology. I mean, well, let me step back a minute. In general, the monarchy is presented in a sort of vaguely positive light, but the only individual which is really presented positively is, of course, Peter. But that's, I think, fairly obvious why. I mean, that whatever else you can say about the current government, its cultural platform is not anti-Western Slavophilism. I mean, what they're pushing is, I mean, you may not like it, but what they're pushing is, in fact, a variant of Western culture. And in fact, some of them even say this I mean, no one really, I mean, I don't mean Putin or Lavrov, but people somewhat farther down occasionally say that. By and large, they don't talk about this, but I mean, it's very obvious that when they do have to give a kind of blurb of a popular quick version of Russian history, that Peter is one of the few people who comes out positively in this. And I think the combination of the victories, the building of Petersburg, and the cultural stuff makes it inescapable. They can't very well. It's very difficult to be against Peter and not adopt. And I mean, the logic of these debates in Russia, if you're against Peter, then you must be an anti-Western Slavophile. That's not logical, but that's the reality of the debates.
Yeah, as a
I don't
person,
know.
sorry.
Yeah, keep going, Nastya.
Yeah, as a person who grew up in St. Petersburg, I can definitely say that Peter the Great is a big brand in modern Russia. And certain politicians even are trying to somehow look alike or adopt certain styles from Peter the Great, generally speaking. We, in fact, got a very interesting question from Ben Nelson. He just read Russell Morton's book about weddings.
Yeah.
So the question is, should we view Peter as truly a revolutionary or a continuator of reforms ongoing since the end of the 16th century? Could he be both, as suggested in the book?
Well, there is, of course, a certain amount of continuity. I mean, the thing is that I think there's also an element that's, well, for someone of my generation, for much of the 20th century, that you were presented with a history of the Russia before 1689 as if it was a kind of a sort of essence of sort of Drevnaya Rus, of old Russia, and that's how it was. And it was not entirely unchanging, but largely unchanging sort of essence. And then Peter comes along, or Peter just on the eve of Peter's reign, and so on. And that's not, I think, of course, that's not really true. Life is just not like that. And that if you go back and forth to certain things, that you will find that there are predecessors. There are predecessors and event and decisions and various processes that start way before Peter. And you could go through that. I mean, the thing is that you can see this actually in the church. I mean, a lot of this stuff is very technical, and I would, I think, bore everyone silly if I was to try to go into some of it. But there is a lot of things going on in the church that you can see are leading on in a complicated way toward Peter's time. All that being said, I think it's difficult to underestimate the radicalism of some of the changes. Um, and I think the one that strikes me, as I think came out in this presentation, I mean, I do this periodically and I think about it differently a little bit each time, but I think in this presentation, what came out to me very clearly was the scientific side. You know, that's really something that's a bigger issue than I think than we realize. Um, I mean, if you can, if you look at Russia and, you know, say like, hey, let's say 1450, all right, there is at this point essentially zero in terms of science in Russia. There is some very elementary arithmetic, and that's about it. And there are some ideas about the natural world, which about the planets and so on, all of which you could put them together. It would be maybe make 15 pages. Western Europe and the Arab world, the Near East, the Ottomans, the Western Europe, they all have a kind of pre-modern science. Okay, it's pre-modern, but it's still some kind of science. Russia is a kind of, it's not, Russia is a kind, I mean, I think it's important to realize that Russia is a little bit on the periphery of Europe. You know, it's this huge area, but the population is quite small. I mean, Russia in 1500 had a population, the whole of Russia, the whole Russian state had a population that was maybe 3 million people. Okay, France was already 15 or 20. Russia becomes an important country in terms of population and economic development and so on in the course of the 16th, 17th, 18th, and even 19th century. I mean, think about this. At the time of the Napoleonic invasion of Russia in 1812, the population of France, not the French Empire, which included most of Europe, but just France, okay, and the boundaries of 1792, more or less the modern boundaries, was about 30 million. So was the population of Russia. So, you know, much of Russia was sort of empty space. It was this huge territory. I mean, the Russian government state in the eve of Peter's reign had about 3,000 officials in Moscow. Okay, officials means that includes the guy who opens up the door in the morning and starts the fire in the office. I mean, I don't mean like, you know, bureaucrats. I mean somebody who works for the central government, who might be simply a messenger or the janitor, effectively, is 3,000 people. Okay, they're running a country in 1700 that extends from the Polish border to the Pacific Ocean. Okay, so this is a very I don't know. It's not to me very surprising given the low population and the slow development, which is speeding up every century. But it still takes a while. The slow development, it's not very surprising that they don't have anything in the way of science, and that this is really quite a radical change. I don't know if that answers the question or not.
Yeah,
What
I feel
else have you got?
it's pretty sufficient. We actually got multiple questions about Alexei and his death.
Yes.
Some people say he died of natural causes, some believe he was tortured to death. So what is the current historical consensus?
The stories about how first of all, there's a lot of falsification of documents. Um, and the documents, the documents about what was happening were to a large extent falsified in the mid-19th century by a guy named Ustralov, who was a sort of government, very much a spokesman for the imperial government. And what he was trying to do was to make sure that you didn't get the idea in other words, you were trying to make you think that this was purely a personal, a purely personal emotional dispute between father and son with no political element. So what he did was he took the documents from the Austrian archives where Alexei was telling them what he was going on, and he just left out parts of it. So he effectively falsified the material. Okay. So what happened to him that is the only evidence that there is, the only evidence is that he it's not clear that there was any significant, I mean, there was always a certain amount of judicial torture in the early 18th century in Europe. It's not clear that it was particularly excessive or even very much of it, and the guy just died. He was never very healthy. I don't think it's very surprising. It solved Peter a problem, that's true. But it's not terribly, none of, one of the problems with all of this, I mean, I don't know if you could do this stuff retrospectively. But you see, part of the problem with the Romanov dynasty in the 17th and 18th centuries is that as a genetic pool, frankly, it was a disaster area. I mean, if you look at the children of Tsar, first of all, if you look at the children over the course of the 17th century, what you will find is that the males are very unhealthy. That you will, I mean, like, for example, Tsar Alexei produced his first son, Alexei Alexeyevich, died at age 19 in 1669. Then he married again Peter's mother. He produces one son with Peter who is healthy. And then another, but he already has 2 or 3 sons from the first wife, both of whom were physical disaster areas. The women are all healthy as rocks. I mean, what exactly was the problem? But, it's one of these genetic oddities. You'll have to get the doctors to explain this to you. And this is then reproduced in Peter's family. Why is it that the country is run by women in the 18th century? Because Peter produces male children, all of whom die in infancy. Alexei was the first one. He lasted the longest. Then Peter produced 2 or 3 other children whom he was hoping would be the heirs to the throne, and they then died. Then we have another one who becomes Peter II, who dies of smallpox at age 19. Well, okay, yes, smallpox was an infective disease, but it was all over the place. He gets it and dies, the other ones don't. All right, the women all manage fine. So the result is that this result of this is that when the guards officers decide that they want somebody on the throne who is capable of running the country, they always end up with women. So, I mean, I don't think this is very surprising. There's a basic genetic mess with it. And if you want to ask the question, why is the Romanov dynasty not unhealthy in the 19th century? Okay, there's the hemophilia, but that comes in kind of late. Why are they okay? Answer, well, read Catherine the Great's memoirs. She makes it perfectly clear that Tsar Pavel Petrovich was in fact the son of Sergei Saltykov. So there's a different genetic pool there from Paul on. And they are actually quite the Romanovs from the, as we call them by courtesy, from the 1790s onward, are in fact, the 19th century, are remarkably, on the whole, healthy lot, with the exception of this hemophilia business very much at the end. But the people between Tsar Michael and the end of the 18th century are a mess. So I don't think this is terribly difficult to understand. And the supposed documents that claim that he died in torture were written in the 1830s.